Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Central European Green Transport Initiative's Battery Series. This is part one, the state of the battery ecosystem in Central and Eastern Europe. My name is Aaron Fishbone. I am a senior policy advisor at the Slovak Electric Vehicle Association, and I'll be your host for this exciting and really quite timely look at the battery and energy storage system supply chain in the Central European region. As many of you probably know, Central and Eastern Europe is one of the leading battery and battery parts manufacturing regions in Europe and the world, and you'll hear that in greater detail from our panelists. But as we also know, there is a, quote, battery arms race taking place in the world today. And even with the favorable regulatory environment, which one of our panelists will discuss in greater detail, without the right mix of investments, skills, and industrial policy and development, as well as political will from national policymakers, as well as European policymakers and local ones, this leading global position could be lost to others, and with that, a significant domestic capacity in Europe. So we want to look at the industry here, see what are the lessons learned from how it's developed, who's here, and what are the opportunities for investors going forward so that we can continue to build on the existing capacities and investments. So without further ado, I want to introduce our esteemed panelists, experts in this topic as well, and authors of some of the key reports on this topic focusing on the region. We have Patrik Krizansky, Vice President of AVERE, the European Association for Electromobility from Bratislava, Slovakia. We have Aleks Rajch, board member of the Polish New Mobility Association, calling in from Warsaw, Poland. And we have Filip Křenek, who's an analyst at Europeum, the European Institute on International Affairs, who's based in Prague. And so, without further ado, I want to welcome our panelists in their presentations, starting with Patrik.
Before I actually start, let me just quickly introduce AVERE, which is the European Association for Electromobility based in Brussels, which actually represents the whole variety of the stakeholders from the OEMs, charge point operators, different companies, but also the national associations. And actually, it's fairly old, founded in 1978. So, back in that time, the e-mobility wasn't so sexy, like today. But, we're building the ecosystem of the e-mobility and trying to influence the ecosystem also from Brussels up to the national level. But maybe let me just jump into the real numbers, because we try to dig into the numbers on the CEE region and looking at the OEMs and the production of EVs in individual countries. And I'm not sure if everybody on this webinar actually realized that Central Eastern Europe is actually the power hub of production, electric vehicle production. And if you look at some numbers, all 27 countries in the EU produce around 13 million vehicles a year. But just by looking at these 6 countries, which we picked as the leaders in the automotive production, some 4 million vehicles are produced every year. And just look at some examples here. When I go from Czech Republic, the annual production is some 1.4 million cars. And Czechia is actually number 2 global per capita producer of cars totally. If you look at the logos, these OEMs actually produce the electric vehicles already. So Škoda with the Enyaqs, maybe in 2026 launching a new model. Hyundai is producing Kona Electric in Noszowice, and Iveco is doing or producing the electric buses. And totally, we're at some 180,000 electric vehicles made in 2023. If I look at Slovakia, neighboring country to Czech Republic, which is number 1 per capita producer of cars in the world, there are some 1.1 million cars made in 2023, out of which around 130,000 were electric. And just imagine this, actually the scale goes from 9% of the total production capacity at Kia up to 28% at Volkswagen. And what is actually very thrilling, the new models will arrive next year, and in 2026, and I'm talking about new fully electric models like Porsche Cayenne. But what is really important, Stellantis actually already launched a very new model, which is actually focused on the mainstream market, Citroën ë-C3, which is this 20,000 euro car, which should really convince the mass customer to buy electric. And when speaking about Slovakia, there will be a completely new factory coming in 2026, which will produce only electric vehicles, around 250,000, which will be the facility of Volvo just being built. Jumping into Poland, which is number 2 of electric buses in Europe, you see that MAN, Solaris, and Scania are actually producing electric buses. So the manufacturing capacity of these facilities are really the key for the electric buses penetration in Europe. But what is really important is actually that Poland is also the hub for the light duty vehicles, electric, of course, made in Volkswagen plant and the Mercedes working on the new electric vans. If I jump into Hungary, of course, this is again one of the leading countries in the world producing cars, number 3 per capita. But if I look at the electric models, they actually make, out of 500,000 vehicles, they already make significant number of Mercedes models, namely EQB. And actually, Mercedes is investing 1 billion euro into new facility, preparing the launch of the completely new models based on the new platform MB.EA. And another big investment comes from BMW, 2 billion euro, which shall be actually launched in 2026 with fully electric Neue Klasse model, and additionally with a battery assembly facility at Debrecen. Maybe I will just mention Romania, where a low number of electric vehicles is made, but Ford actually makes its new electric Ford Transit Courier in Romania. And if I speak about Slovenia, Renault actually not officially but unofficially released an information that potentially new electric Twingo should be made in its facility in Novo Mesto. So if you look at the total numbers, out of 13 million cars totally in European Union, 4 million are made in these 6 countries, and a significant number of electric vehicles already today is made in this region. Plus in 2025 and 26, number of new models, fully electric models, will be launched in these 6 countries. If you look at the compact size of the region, if you just put a 1 point on the border between Slovakia, Czechia, and Poland, you see that 500 kilometers actually reaching almost entire region. And just if you add some few hundred kilometers, like 700 kilometers, you are already in Bavaria or in the northern Italy, where there are significant capacities and facilities located, working already on electric vehicles, like from BMW or from Volkswagen or from Stellantis in Italy. So the compact size actually makes the market very attractive for making the cars today, but also for making or producing of the components and potentially batteries, also for wider European region. Now, if I just, for this introduction, if I pose some questions, I mean, there are a couple of questions which actually are key for the region, maybe for the entire EU, but for the region for sure. One of them is actually, how do we actually convince the mass consumer to buy EVs? And I think this region has actually some of the answers, because there are a number of models which will be launched in 2025 and 26, or which were already launched this year, which have this 20,000 euro price tag, and they might be very attractive for the mass consumers. And these models will be made in the CEE. Of course, there are plenty of other questions, like where we can get the renewable energy, and how we can get actually reasonable priced electricity, because this is actually the big question for not only the region, the CEE region, but also for the entire EU. But one of the key questions would be, how do we compete with the Asian battery producers? Luckily for the region, some of them are actually based in the CEE. I guess Aleks will actually talk more about this information. But you know, we need to build a significant capacity for the battery production in the region. But as you saw, the numbers of EVs will be growing, and they will be from big portion or in big numbers made in the CEE region. So Aaron, for this introductory remarks, let me turn back to you, and I would be ready to answer some of these questions.
Super. Thank you, Patrik. I mean, since you posed the very same questions that you were, intending to be answered, I think you've already kind of fed the discussion a little bit. Your point with showing, what was your point with showing the, kilometer radius, the radius distance from, on the map? You said within 500 kilometers, there's all of these different, end users and customers, right? But for what exactly?
Well, if you look at the distance which you need to travel with your components, but or with the vehicles to the major markets like Germany, Italy, or further to the east, to the west, into France. I mean, you need to look at some reasonable distance. And if you look at the battery capacities or batteries produced for the OEMs based in the region, I mean, 500 kilometers would be very reasonable distance to travel, and to have the reasonable distance for the future investments into new capacities, either for the OEMs and components or for the battery value chain. So that was meant by 500 kilometers radius. And many times people actually do not realize that the CEE region is actually very concise and compact for the logistics purposes as well.
Yeah. And so, but your point is that, because you also talked about, the vehicle capacity that was already, local in the region. So your point is that batteries and cells and battery components that are produced in the region could go to OEM facilities that are also located there and then be, effectively shipped out as sort of final product vehicles, or they could be themselves exported as component parts to other markets to be used in other products.
Absolutely.
Like vehicles manufactured in other parts.
Absolutely. Like if you take 500 kilometers and you actually locate your capacities, production facilities in the region for future battery value chain, so you reach the entire region within 500 kilometers, and potentially other main markets like Germany.
And I mean, I know Aleks will talk about more, about the capacities that are in the region, so we don't want to, skip ahead to his remarks too soon. But you also talked about energy prices. And can you speak a little bit more about that before we transition off of you? I mean, that's been a huge, let's say, variable and a huge factor in certain, investment decisions thus far. And what does that look like now? And what does it look like going forward?
Absolutely. I mean, energy prices are actually, or electricity prices are actually the key component for the future battery industry investment, because obviously you need a lot of electricity for each battery, a kilowatt hour of battery cell, around 15 kilowatts per each kilowatt hour of battery cell capacity. So if you just think of it of this, you need not only a good electricity price, or very reasonably priced, but also a lot of renewable energy. or a lot of low emission electricity, because obviously battery passport and the carbon footprint coming from the or calculated based on the EU battery regulation will be very tough to meet. So this is actually a big challenge for not only for the EU but also for the region, how to build up sufficient new capacities for renewables, which will, by the way, make also the electricity price lower.
Well, that is an absolutely perfect segue over to our next speaker, Filip from Europeum. Please take it away. The floor is yours. You will talk much more about the various regulations and European legislative and framework that Patrik just mentioned.
Yes, thank you so much for the introduction. I will just share my screen. Hope you can see the slides. There we go. So yeah, I will talk a bit about the kind of the EU policy framework that deals with batteries and critical raw minerals in more general terms. I will specifically focus on three recent legislative files, which is the Critical Minerals Act, the Battery Regulation, and the new Net Zero Industry Act. So these three are sort of the most recent, but of course there are a few more elements to the puzzle. I will start with the Critical Minerals Act, which is sort of a recent development, entered into force in May this year. It aims at ensuring that Europe has a secure and sustainable supply of critical raw minerals to supply the EU industry. And of course, as it was highlighted during the COVID-19 and the subsequent Russian invasion to Ukraine, Europe is at risk of having these strategic dependencies, which were exposed, of course, when the supply chains have diminished during the COVID pandemic or have been weaponized. So with this act, what the EU is trying to do is to strengthen the domestic supply of these critical raw minerals and to reduce our reliance on single suppliers, because of course Europe does not have so as many sources of these minerals as it would need to reach its ambitions. So one way of doing that, of gaining this supply, is to diversifying, because currently, pretty much most of our rare minerals come from one specific country, which is China, which is the main country for both mining and processing of some of these rare minerals. So these are just some of the goals that the EU aims to achieve within the end of this decade. 10% domestic extraction, meaning extraction happening directly in Europe, 40% of domestic processing, 15% of domestic recycling. Again, that is goes in the direction of decreasing our need for additional new imports. And then finally, 35% should be sourced from another country, meaning that no more than 65% should come from one single country by the end of this decade. And of course, in addition to this, it's not just about setting targets, but it's also about making sure that these projects actually work, meaning projects for the mining and refining of critical raw minerals. So the EU the Critical Raw Minerals Act establishes so-called strategic projects, which will then benefit from easier permitting, meaning that there is less administrative burden and they should go faster in order to start their work as soon as possible. And of course, there is also the element of improved access to finance for this project. Moving on to the second piece of legislation, which is highly relevant, of course, in this context, is the battery regulation, which is not as recent. It already came into force last year in August. And basically what it does is replace the pre-existent legislation, which was a so-called batteries directive. The regulation will sort of be phased in gradually, so will not kick in immediately, but there are different elements to it which will start working at different points in time, eventually kind of phasing into a common EU-wide regulation, so that we have a single sort of legislative framework for dealing with batteries throughout Europe, instead of this, what we used to have, a patchwork of different legislation at each member state level. And so what the regulation does, it applies to all batteries in the EU, independently on the batteries or raw materials that are used. So it's not just about EV batteries, but it goes deeper than that. It applies to all manufacturers, producers, importers of batteries in the EU, and it regulates the batteries throughout their whole life cycle. Now, this is really important because it comes with some strings attached, particularly for the producers. So the regulation has, I kind of would like to talk about some elements of it, which I find really important. It has this kind of circular economy approach. So it promotes circular use of batteries, reuse, repurposing, and recycling at the end of their life cycle. So producers in that regard are responsible for collecting, treating, and recycling some of these batteries. We have the collection targets for EV batteries here specifically on the slide, which is to have 51% by the end of 2028, going up by additional 10% by 2031. Sorry. Now that is a requirement imposed on the producers themselves. And then there are specific recycling targets and recycling and material recovery rates that you can also see on the slide. I again try to highlight the lithium batteries, which in this context are the most relevant, but of course there are other types of batteries, because as I said, this regulation is really comprehensive and covers not just EV batteries, but all sorts of batteries. Now, a new element of this regulation is also the so-called EU battery passport, which should introduce certain labeling requirements to provide not just kind of professionals, but also consumers with information on how the raw materials, for instance, were sourced, if they were sourced, using correct, labor and environmental standards according to, again, international, due diligence standards. The passport itself should be functional from 2027 and allow basically for the transparency and traceability of the battery throughout its life cycle, making it easier also for, let's say, car mechanics to repurpose or to reuse or to repair the battery at some point. So basically it would be like a passport where you encode all of the information relating to the battery from basically the manufacturing throughout the whole life cycle and towards the end. So at the end, if you want to recycle it, basically what minerals the battery contains, how it was used throughout its life, etc. So this is basically the outlook on the battery regulation. And then I will move to the third element that I wanted to highlight, which is the Net Zero Industry Act. Now, the first two pieces of legislation, they were mostly about targets. The Net Zero Industry Act also has its own target, which is to increase Europe's manufacturing capacity of net zero technologies by 2030 to 40% of the annual deployment needs of Europe. That means that Europe will need to scale up these net zero technologies, including batteries, of course, but also others like grid technologies, so charging infrastructure and so on. And aside from this target alone, there are these elements of support measures. For instance, one key thing is that what the Net Zero Industry Act is trying to do is to simplify the permitting procedures for projects that deal with manufacturing net zero technologies and reduce the administrative burden. There should be a single point of contact for the permitting procedure in each EU member state, and the procedures should be shortened to 12 or 18 months, depending on the production capacity. And in case this specific project is given the status of a strategic project, it should be even shorter, between 9 and 12 months. There are additional elements to the Net Zero Industry Act, such as facilitating access to markets more sustainability and resilience criteria in public procurements, for instance. What this means is, for instance, this resilience criterion is that no more than a certain percentage should be sourced from one given third country. But of course, given that the EU has entered into some regional or even global trade agreements with certain partners, this criteria, for instance, cannot really be used to restrict the access to public procurements in the EU. But what it means is basically that a lot of the manufacturing should be done in Europe, and there will be certain criteria, including in public procurements, that make sure that this is the case. And then to finish off, I would just like to mention a few other elements of this new legislation. Net zero academies. Now the EU is pledging sort of to build up a capacity of skilled labor within 3 years. I think it's around 100,000 workers, and also to support the mutual recognition of labor skills in this particular market of net zero technologies, which is really important to improve the mobility of workers across the EU, across the region. It's also industrial partnership, so that means collaboration with like-minded countries to diversify the trade and investment in net zero technology. But it's also net zero acceleration valleys, which is sort of an area, a region where these net zero technologies can work together. And once you have sort of an approved acceleration valley, it's easier to set up another manufacturing site within this particular region. And it can also use kind of the networking effects of having those industries in close collaboration with each other. And I think that's it for me as in introductory remarks. Thanks a lot for the invitation, and back to you, Aaron.
Thank you, Filip, for this very comprehensive but brief summary overview of some key pieces of legislation. So all of these 3 laws that you mentioned were passed in 2024. And I mean, if you step back from looking at them, what is the significance of them, of this package? What are they designed to achieve as a group? And do you think that they are, let's say, levers that are going to push properly in that direction?
So, yeah, I mean, stepping back is, of course, important to see the bigger picture. What basically happened in the last few years was that, we had COVID, we had these supply chain disruptions, we had the war in Ukraine. And so what the EU is trying to do is to create really like a holistic framework for net zero industries, including, of course, batteries. But in the broader sense, trying to diversify and building more resilient supply chains. What does it actually mean? Well, it means that the manufacturing capacity has to be in Europe. So I think that is the clear trend that we are seeing, that all of these support measures and these targets, they mean that we have some ambitious green targets. We still want to pursue them, but the way that we will be pursuing them is through having a lot of the manufacturing capacity present directly in Europe, because the risks of missing those targets and the risks of having these supply chains again sort of disrupted is too high. So that is why I think a lot of the production will have to take place in Europe, and also why a lot of these measures are aimed at attracting also like foreign manufacturing companies, foreign projects, partnerships with third countries, and so on, to have like a transfer of know-how, which is beneficial for both sides.
Okay, super. There's a bunch of questions for you in the chat, but I'll ask one more now, which I mean, you talked about sort of access to markets in your under NZIA, and I'm wondering, is that in the context of access to, say, European manufactured goods to international markets, and which ones, or is it the ability for international investors to invest in projects in Europe, or both?
It's actually both. Yeah, I mean, what I mentioned, the facilitating the access to markets is to kind of, motivate, incentivize companies that have, are working in a certain net zero tech. It doesn't have to be batteries. It can be, solar power, wind, or anything, to have kind of an advantage, to give them an edge when they are applying, because we discussed how these projects can be very costly, but of course, as soon as they are able to contribute to one of these major EU goals, they should have some sort of advantage for being in line with the targets that we are trying to achieve. So, for instance, I've spoken about these strategic projects. The criteria for their selection is if the project contributes to one of these ambitious goals. If it contributes to the industry supply chain of net zero technologies, if it could, de-risking of the supply chains, or the technological and industrial capacity of Europe, then that project will be supported. So it's a way of supporting projects both from inside the EU and from outside the EU that have these ambitions and they have the technology. It may be costly, but that's why we have the financing on the other side.
Reflecting a question from the Q&A, do you know about the procedure for applying for any of these strategic projects? Like, how would one go about doing so?
Yeah, so we have already, for the Critical Raw Minerals Act, there is already an open call. So, if any of the participants of this webinar are interested to find out more, it's open until August. But of course, I mean, these projects, they tend to be really very big. So I don't think that is really sufficient time to prepare, a mining and a refining projects somewhere. But still, it gives us an insight into how this will work in general. So you can find all the documents online already. For the Net Zero Industry Act, the call is not out yet, but basically it will contain like a preset form that needs to be filled out. You need to supply additional documents like a business plan, a draft timetable, and so on. And the important thing about this is, for instance, that also project promoters from third countries can apply for this project. So it's not just projects that are pre-existent in the EU. It may be future projects with backing from, coming from a third country. But in terms of the evaluation, I've already mentioned the criteria for selecting the procedures. It will be, how they contribute to the bigger EU goals.
Okay, thank you. And one more question, maybe briefly, but could you elaborate on the battery passport? Sort of how it is, what it will look like, how it is developed, how it is actually can be used, and I guess what if what if an element does not meet the standards that requires? Are there penalties?
So the battery passport, I mean, there are still discussions how exactly it will look like. I mean, what we know is that there are different layers of informations that should be available to, let's say, the regular customer, like a professional auto mechanic, and so on. And so these elements should be, relatively easily accessible. You have, of course, kind of the environmental and sustainability criteria. You have the information about the materials there, the rare earths, where they have been sourced from. And all of this information should be encoded, online, and then easily accessible via a sort of QR code, basically, to anyone. And as I said, there should be layers to the passport that are accessible to different audiences. We already seen like some good examples in Europe being developed in Europe. We have, there is a Global Battery Alliance. There is the Siri Pass, Catena X, I think it's called. We have the Betro. So there are, some projects, basically, sometimes private-public collaborations, making sure that we have examples which work relatively well, or they are in pilot testing phase. I think this is probably the direction in which it's going. But you have also like smaller startups also trying to get a foot in the door. Voila, I think that's it.
Okay, super. Thank you very much. All right, so now let's go over to our last presentation from Aleks Rajch at the Polish New Mobility Association.
Thank you, Aaron. That's great to be here. Let me just share my screen as well. I represent the New Mobility Association, previously PSPA, what we were probably more widely recognized as, and I'm the co-founder and board member of this organization. We have nearly 300 members, and many of them are lithium-ion battery companies, not only manufacturers, but also companies from the value chain. We're also partners of EIT InnoEnergy, and we have a partnership with the European Battery Alliance, where we kind of emanate the European Battery Alliance into Central Eastern Europe. So we're in that value chain kind of, and also discussing those things on the policy levels in Brussels. So also glad to see AVERE supporting this process as well. In terms of my presentation, I'm going to focus more on the batteries. So obviously, we're going to have this huge battery demand. This is why we're talking about it. It's a global situation. So in Europe, we're going to have around 1.8 terawatt hours if we actually look at it in the best potential scenario that the industry would want. Even in the lowest scenario, we have 1.5 terawatt hours of demand in 2035. Now, I think many of the people who are watching this will recall when the 2035, ICE phase out came in and Fit for 55 and the legislative package. Everybody was saying it's so far away, it's so far away. It suddenly has become a little over 10 years. It's not very far away. It's very soon. We need to catch up because you see the demand from 2022. This is growing, exponentially. So we need to match this. And this is not only the manufacturing, it's also the resources side, the critical raw materials side, and it's also the recycling side. On top of this, we have the digital passport or battery passport, if you like, and the traceability element. So this is just an entire huge ecosystem where we perceive that Europe, and especially Central Eastern Europe, can still find its kind of niche, its spot to become a power hub industrial-wise. Now, how does it look, compared to other global powers? So China, of course, is the biggest manufacturer of batteries at nearly 80%, but also China is the biggest market for critical raw materials and rare earth metals refining processes. So this is very important because we actually have quite a lot of lithium in terms of the underground deposits in Europe and Northern America and Southern America and other places. What we don't have is refining facilities and technologies. And again, China has 80% of that capacity globally. So this is very important because we, of course, use lithium oxides. We don't use the lithium alone and so on with all the other battery chemistry components. So this is what we need predominantly. And of course, we see close to the end of the decade, 2027 is not an accidental date. It's the date that is used quite often in the European battery regulation. So this is why we're saying, of course, we're going to drop a little bit. Hungary has some investors coming in. That's probably why they will gain this position. But still, we will be in the top 10. But a lot has to be done to develop an ecosystem around it. And how does that look? Well, if you look at the battery producers, we're actually, in terms of Central Eastern Europe, quite strong. You see, of course, there's Poland. We have a number of facilities. We have the largest EV battery manufacturing facility in the world and one of the largest ones for EV batteries and one of the largest in batteries in general for lithium-ion technologies. That's EV Energy Solution Wrocław. But there are others. We have very innovative companies like Norvolt, Impact Clean Power Technology. But if you look around Central Eastern Europe, there's much more. And it's very important to understand that this is an opportunity that we have that will not last forever, because those facilities have to function in a defined ecosystem, an ecosystem where there's, first of all, tier 1, tier 2 suppliers, the chemistry, the electrolyte, the components, the modules, everything has to be supplied. Most of these big facilities are actually assembly plants. So a lot has to be done to deliver the components for that assembly. But if you look to the West, Western, Northern European states, you see they're catching up. And you see, of course, Germany with the biggest automotive market. And obviously there, some facilities are coming along. Mostly OEMs are developing these facilities. And of course, this is the best route to market because then you're on site, but then labor costs are a little bit different. And then if you look at other countries, they're still not that advanced, but that also suggests one thing. Perhaps this is a strategy that has been well thought, before. So I think it actually is, because in fact, what we really need is that entire supportive ecosystem. And if you see on the next slide, this is what's slowly being developed. Of course, Europe is, very far behind. And this is an opportunity that we see with the, Inflation Reduction Act in the US. We see with what's happening in China, but there are other markets like India, like Indonesia, like Malaysia, like Vietnam. That are also looking into developing active materials for lithium-ion batteries. They're also looking at new chemistries, niobium, for example, which is a very important metal that probably will replace some of the battery chemistries in the future with its stability, and especially in thermal terms. So that's being developed, but we see nearly none of this is being done in Europe. So again, Germany has some capacities, but only one facility officially states that it has that 106,000 ton capacity of developing some of these active materials, and they're actually mostly related to nickel and not cobalt and not lithium. So not those that are today probably the most important, especially for NMC chemistries. If we go to the recycling, here we see suddenly that the gravity of the developments of this industry is shifted from Central Eastern Europe to Western Europe. Of course, again, these are mostly declared capacities. We don't see those capacities being developed, mostly because we're looking at post-production materials, so mostly, as we call it in industrial jargon, scraps. So the metal that has been left over and the critical raw materials that have been left over after the production of the actual EV battery. So we see we have some capacities here in Germany. BASF is actually developing some facilities across Europe, and you see, I think the data is pretty much widely known. I'm just showing that kind of shift of investment away from Central Eastern Europe that we need to bring back to support that very strong production volume. But what I think is important to note here is that the European Union is pushing a little bit for hydrometallurgical processes and recycling, which are mostly good for NMC chemistries. You don't see that much in LFP chemistries with the ferrous, especially component of that chemistry. So that is a little bit of a challenge because obviously with most of the Asian technologies being predominantly now introducing LFP chemistries to the market, we're going to have a little bit of a challenge in developing hydrometallurgical capacities therein. But still, this is some of the, that's maybe an analysis of some of the potential areas that we can still locate here. So with that volume and with that existing knowledge and competence that there is in Central Eastern Europe and in Europe as a whole, of course, we have the potential to develop this market. We have the good conditions with NZIA, which maybe could be better in some places, but it is in place to attract those investments. Now, why do we need to do that? So we've looked at it from a Polish perspective, because it's always an ecosystem, and developing that ecosystem, and we looked at the new mobility ecosystem, so everything surrounding clean transport. We could add 5% to the Polish GDP again in 2035. Once again, I'm just going to repeat, this is very soon. And so we can really develop industrial potential, economic potential to do this. Now, we're actually looking at this as a member of AVERE, I know. We're looking at this in a European scale in Brussels. But so far, the data shows for Poland that we need a number of steps to do this. And I think those steps are true for the entire region, actually. So first of all, we need to have that production capacity. And so we have e-mobility for Poland, but for Central Eastern Europe, there's that industrial potential we need to develop. There is, of course, charging infrastructure, which is highly linked to it. And in terms of research and development, you know, matching the potential of MCS chargers to the new BMS systems and battery resilience is very important, for example, for the electrification of the heavy-duty vehicle ecosystem. And here again, number 3 is exactly that, electrification of the logistics network in Europe. This is very important. This is, you can say, the circulatory system of Europe in terms of transport and the delivery systems. And this is important to actually have that decarbonized fully as well. Very difficult, but already technologies and funding is accessible. Renewables. Renewables are not a problem in terms of production of energy. That's, let's say, step 1. But actually what's important is stabilizing the grids, balancing the grids. And here, again, one of the main components is actually storage systems, energy storage systems, so batteries. We come back to the main topic. Research and development. Now, in Europe, we have a lot of this focus on kind of developing innovative ideas, but there's very little implementation actually, and very little scalability. So this is something we need to focus on. And for Poland, this is true in particular. And of course, any form of subsidies and support mechanisms, they don't have to be direct subsidies. They can vary. They can be scrapping subsidies. They can be various mechanisms that can help. And really, we can achieve this. But is this easy? No, it's not. For Poland alone, if we look at the battery sector, we have a little over 100 gigawatt hour of annual battery production now. If we want this 5% GDP growth, in 2035, we need to have 5 times as much as that. So for the Central Eastern European region, that would be, much, much larger. And you can see those targets are very ambitious. This is exactly how we approach it. It has to be ambitious if we're supposed to give, good results and or highly satisfactory results. And we see that with the automotive industry. We have very little output of EV production in Poland, despite the facilities that have been listed before. We would need 600,000 vehicles produced annually, battery electric vehicles. So this is really huge. And a lot more of these numbers you can see are very, very ambitious. I wanted to focus on the battery industry because this is a topic of the discussion. But that's the kind of thing we're seeing. So there is this economic drive, there is this environmental drive, and there is this potential. And so we come to the point where we need to ask ourselves, how do we get this done to really exploit this potential? And I hope that puts things in perspective. And yeah, I'm ready for the questions.
Super. Thank you, Alex. We have a bunch of questions in the chat, which we'll get to. And also, guys, I want to invite you to ask each other questions. So if you do, raise your hand and let me know. But we'll start with a quick one from the audience. What is the main battery format being mass produced in Europe?
Well, I mean, it's shifting because NMC was the previous model. Now it's shifting to LFP. And actually, LFP is also the chemistry that is being mostly produced by the Asian manufacturers in Central Eastern Europe. And
are these going to be... Oh, go for Patrik.
Yeah, maybe I will just add, it's as Alex mentioned, LFPs in terms of the chemistry is going to smaller models, like Renault is thinking of LFP because that would make actually the model cheaper. But if we talk about the format, it's also very diverse. I think dominantly it's prismatic, with some pouch batteries used, I think, by Kia, but also BMW is thinking of the cylindrical cells for their Neue Klasse BMW. So it's not really unified in terms of the OEMs.
And now Tesla has its own cylindrical model. So, but that's of course, the way you actually do the cells, the modules, and how you think of that. And then the casing, also Tesla has its own ideas for the casing. But in terms of, so lack of casing actually, but that's a different topic. But in terms of chemistries, so obviously, if we're looking at, what the kind of critical raw materials we need, NMC is probably a little more delicate because you have that manganese and cobalt in there that is a little bit more rare and difficult to obtain. You have lithium in both. And then the LFP is a little bit more accessible. We'll see. And then we get the knowledge from the battery companies that these new chemistries are coming in, and that's a whole different story.
And is the direction of, let's say, chemistry and technological development in line with what the regulations are going to be calling for?
Yeah, I think
it meet targets.
Yeah, because so the Critical Raw Materials Act actually makes a pretty, I think, a very comprehensive sets a pretty comprehensive scene for how we're going to deal with critical raw materials. So both in terms of what's coming in, what's being recycled, how it's being reapplied. And that's good because there is a very long list of these critical raw materials. And so we can also adapt that to the new chemistries that are coming along. Because the European battery regulation, it in fact actually regulates the current chemistries that we know. That's why some of the numbers that Filip showed for the recycling targets that are in the battery regulation, they actually concern what we know today and what we produce today, which is, I think, realistic because again, if we have new chemistries coming in, they will not come in tomorrow. That is probably the next decade that this will become scalable. First, they have to be tested and deployed at scale, which is not happening yet. So yes, I think the regulations in Europe are good for that. And what's more important, the regulations in Europe make it better or more profitable, to put it bluntly, to produce in Europe, because then you're part of the cycle and you get the recycled metals back into your own production potential.
Super. Thank you, Patrik. Do you have a question on this topic or something else?
I will, again, because that's a very interesting question, because I think in terms of LFP as the chemistry, it also supports, a cheaper price or lower price of the battery module, because, if we want to compete with the Chinese manufacturers for those 20,000 euro cars, or around this price tag, that's the only way to go. So, you know, to make them with LFP batteries to be competitive against the Chinese manufacturers. And in terms of the format, I think it will definitely go more into like the cell to the pack frame, or you know, architecture, because you need to increase the energy density. So you want to save the space, right? So, you know, you will definitely go to more of these innovative setups of the cells in the pack.
I think this is a really good discussion also for our next episode in this series, really focusing on, you know, the direction of technological development in the region and cell manufacturing and pack manufacturing. I want to go to another question, which is, how do Central and Eastern European countries plan to address the requirements of the battery passport for calculating CO2 equivalent emissions based on country average emissions? Poland may be at a significant disadvantage here. I know it's long, but did you get to that?
Well, I mean, is that a question for me?
It's a question for anyone, but there is a particular focus on Poland.
Yeah, so in terms of, European battery regulation, yes, it is in place as of February this year, but I can assure you that the state is still preparing to really implement it. And despite it being in a regulation and not needing implementation, it, of course, will need a lot to be done for it to function properly. So in terms of the digital passport, I know this is still being consulted. Obviously, the European Battery Regulation Act has 39 delegated acts that actually define each of the procedures that are being defined in the regulation. So these are still being consulted. And actually, I know that the ministry is still meeting the industry, and we're part of this process, so I know it hands-on. I don't think there is a plan for that. Moreover, in terms of the CO2 emission question, or part of that question, that's also related to many other EU law implementation processes. I think the most important of them, and this is a whole different industry, seemingly, which is RED 2 and the RED 3. So Poland has not yet implemented RED 2. That's the directive on promoting renewable energy sources, or renewable energy directive. And so that has not been implemented. And there are the carbon credits mechanisms and the whole certificate trading mechanisms that have not been defined yet in Poland, or even regulated yet in Poland. We are expecting drafts on this law in Q3, Q4. So I think it's a very similar process to the topic of the question. We're not yet prepared to define that. And actually, the European Commission has not yet defined how those national points for the digital passport supervision are supposed to be developed or implemented. So on one hand, the Polish state is not yet ready to do this, but on the other hand, it hasn't gotten the instruction yet. And I think it's similar for other member states, not only Central Eastern European, because I've spoken to French stakeholders, for example, and there's no steps have been taken in France so far either. So,
okay, I have another question from the audience here, and we're running out of time. Excuse me, so probably have time for two more, or a closing statement or something like that. You know, how much is it's directed at you, Aleks, but I think anyone's, please, I'm opening it to all the panelists. You know, how much is the fight for a sustainable battery market an environmental, let's say, initiative, or how much of it is an economic opportunity?
Yeah, I can start, because I try to express it with my slides. It's both. So on one hand, we need to do this. We need to replace, internal combustion engines. Lithium-ion technologies are the ones we right now know to work. And, Patrik showed that radius of 500 kilometers for the deliveries of that, whole value chain. It's also known that 80% of all logistics are below 500 kilometers. So there is an additional argument that we can actually do that 500-kilometer radius with electric trucks. So we can really develop this ecosystem. It's really great. It's really exciting. It's just, we kind of need to make everyone understand this, because they're still thinking it's some kind of technology. The future is not. So this is the environmental side of things. We can really decarbonize this sector practically fully. We can talk about, brakes and tires and those other emissions, but they're infinitesimal. We're really talking about decarbonizing the sector. And it's a question of understanding that. And then there's that second question. If we manage to attract all those investors, as we're trying to do, and get really a lot of investment going from around the world, in Europe, in Central Eastern Europe, provide jobs, develop competence, really make it a sustainable sector, then we can just really increase economic value. So it's both.
Yeah, Patrik?
Yes, a couple of comments actually. I would even go further and say we calculated in Slovakia that around 60, exactly 3% of the total volume of the logistics goes up to 50 kilometers. So, you know, the country is Slovakia with lots of factories and component suppliers to OEMs. They just supply 50 kilometers and not more. So it's like, you know, in times logistics, truck going between the factories. And what I would like to say also, we actually originated, or we actually designed this webinar series also to talk about the CEE as the region for potential economic for potential investment. So, you know, there is a big economic opportunity not to invest into individual countries, but to invest into the region, which, if you look at the map, by the investment, you will actually cover a huge area of you know, multiple OEMs, hundreds of the first and second tier suppliers, of which many are suppliers for the e-mobility or future electric models. So it is a big economic opportunity for the region. But what I would like to stress, and here I would come back to Filip actually, you know, we have this Net Zero Industry Act already efficient, but the problem for the region is not only the permitting process and how to make it streamlined, but also a chunk of money which we would actually dedicate to the new investments, like you know the state aid schemes. So, and that's why AVERE is actually fighting for with the new European Parliament and European Commission. We will be definitely discussing the battery bank, which might actually have you know, the pool of money available for this kind of green investments in the EU without looking at the national borders, because only this is the way how the EU as a whole can be competitive.
We'll look a lot more at this in the next parts of our series. Thank you. Last word goes to Filip then, in the interest of time.
Okay, thanks a lot. Yeah, no, I just wanted to mention that what the EU is doing already is trying to make, you know, the most economical sense of these opportunities for green tech, including batteries. And so what I think, I mean, what the situation is now is basically that anyone who actually comes to set up shop in Central Eastern Europe will have an early mover, you know, advantage compared to everyone else, because all of these measures that you mentioned, you know, maybe state aid support measures, other financing, you know, banking sector, and so on, this will follow in a very short span of the next few years. We will probably see it very early on with the next commission and the new parliament. But this is exactly the direction in which I see, you know, the EU policies in this area moving, more financing, but already at this point, it's become economical. So if you if you are being clever, of course, you will get that advantage against your competitors.
Super, thank you. This brings us exactly to time, a perfect note to end on. As you see, we have three incredible panelists here, Filip, Patrik, and Aleks, and there's so much to talk about. So we will share the slides from today's webinar. We've recorded the webinar and we'll make it available at some point for you or others to watch on demand. And we will invite you and further notify you for the next parts in our series in the fall, focusing on cell manufacturing development and pack manufacturing development and export as well, and then in the related supply chain, and then the recycling value chain as well, and opportunities for investment and needs for policy levers to be engaged there as well. Thank you all very much for joining us, and wish you a wonderful rest of your day. You know how to reach us should you have further inquiries about how to engage more into the battery space in Central and Eastern Europe. You can contact us on the email that was given on the webinar information, and we'll put you in touch with the right people. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.